Okay, so in these lectures, I want to start talking about this issue of moral luck. And I actually think moral luck is a more interesting and honestly, to my mind, deeper challenge to our thoughts about free will and responsibility than our metaphysical considerations about determinism or the nature of time. Now, I think these metaphysical considerations are interesting. I think it's a fun thing to think about. It gets you to some pretty profound questions. But I honestly think moral luck, even though it gets a little less attention in philosophy, is a more profound and interesting challenge. Okay, so what's moral luck and why is it important? Well, I think to get in this issue of moral luck, we need to get a little bit of background here. And one bit of background that's useful to have is what's called the control condition. Nagel talks about this a little bit, and I think it's very important. It goes by kind of quickly in Nagel, but it's super important. And the control condition says this. The control condition says we are only responsible for what is in our control. If it's outside your control, you are not responsible for it. And now I actually think the control condition's right. And I actually think that the control condition is maybe a better way to articulate what's behind this debate between determinists and libertarians that we looked at earlier, right? Determinists and libertarians both assume that freedom requires an ability to do otherwise. Responsibility requires an ability to do otherwise. Well, I think what this is getting at, if you can't do otherwise, then it's not in your control, right? If you are brainwashed into doing something, it's not in your control. If, you do it because it's a reflex, your arm just moves because the nerves are hitting the right way, it's not in your control, right? If you do it because you're temporarily insane, again, it's not under your control. So I think, the control condition, I think, is the deeper reason behind this, thought that both libertarians and determinists have, that responsibility requires freedom to do otherwise. You know, I think that's a result of the control condition, and we'll talk about this later, if you don't buy the control condition, I think this freedom to do otherwise starts to look a lot less important. Now think about this, right? Um, I think the control condition does explain a lot of our ordinary moral judgments. Um, go back to my way earlier example, right? You know, if someone falls asleep in class because this person has narcolepsy and their medicine's been changed and it's no longer controlling it as well, that's not in their control, right? They cannot control falling asleep. On the other hand, if you whip your phone out and start, texting obnoxiously, especially if you sit toward the front row, this kid always sat near the front of the class, right? It's just like, if you're going to do this, at least sit in the back, right? But if you whip your phone out and start texting, you can control that in a way, the narcoleptic can't control going to sleep, right? Um, Lots of other things we might think of here, right? You know, if someone commits a crime because of a mental illness, say they are schizophrenic and delusional, they can't control having that illness, right? On the other hand, if someone kills, you know, another person because they want the inheritance and they're next in line for the inheritance after they kill this person, well, that is in the person's control. Or it seems to us, if we're not philosophers, right? Clearly in the person's control. You can think of lots of cases like this, right? You know, if you are in control, you are responsible for it. If you're not, you're not, right? If, again, to go back to our other examples, if you don't show up to help me move because your car broke down, or let's say your own apartment caught fire and you have other things to deal with, that's out of your control. You know, assuming it's not some minor bit of routine maintenance you didn't do on your car or your apartment or whatever, that is not in your control. Contrast that with you just don't show up because you don't feel like it, right? If you don't show up because you don't feel like it, you spent, say you're tired because you stayed out too late Friday night and moving on a Saturday, you know, you make the choice not to show up. That's in your control. You also had control over the reason you don't feel so great Saturday morning. You did not have to go out Friday night. Unless we're philosophers and we get deeply into these issues, we think all this is clearly in your control. We blame you if you just don't show up because you don't feel like it. We probably blame you for feeling bad, for staying out too late and drinking too much when you had other obligations. In a way, we wouldn't blame, you if your apartment catches fire or your car breaks down, which are not in your control in the same ways. So, hopefully the control condition's clear to you guys, and hopefully you guys see why I think it's behind this principle that both the determinists and the libertarians agree on, that freedom requires an ability to do otherwise. Responsibility requires an ability to do otherwise. The thought is, if you can't do otherwise, you don't have control, right? So, if the control principle or control condition is true, we should not hold people responsible for things outside their control. That's very clear, right? And what this means is, what does it mean to hold someone responsible? It means to praise or blame them, on, in the more important extreme cases, it even means to punish or reward them, right? All kinds of punishments and rewards you can think of, up to and including, in the case of punishment, sending people to jail or whatever, right? All of that rests on the control principle. If something's not in someone's control, we shouldn't praise them for it. We shouldn't blame them for it. We certainly shouldn't punish them for it, right? Probably not reward them for it either, but definitely not punish. That seems to be an even higher bar than the rest of this. We go even more deeply, when we talk about responsibility, we should not feel pride or shame or guilt over things that aren't in our control, especially guilt, right? If you can't control it, you should not feel guilty about it, right? Sometimes we do feel guilty about things we can't control, right? Trying to think of an example, but if we can't control it, even if people might feel guilty about it, we think that that's in a way neurotic or irrational, right? If someone feels guilty about something and they had no control over it, we would usually tell them, you shouldn't, right? That's irrational. Don't feel guilty. Well, anyway, why is moral luck important? I'll talk more about what moral luck even is in the next few lectures, but the reason moral luck is so important, and I think interesting and ultimately disturbing, is that when we really look at the phenomenon of moral luck, we see that we actually do hold people responsible for things that are outside their control. And in a lot of these cases where we hold people responsible for things that are outside their control, we honestly probably think that it is appropriate to do so. And we think people should hold themselves responsible, should feel guilty maybe for things that are outside of their control, or feel ashamed. If that's true, it seems that we don't really believe the control principle. I actually think it's much more complicated. I actually think we're really inconsistent about the control principle. I think when we get down to it, we'll see that being consistent about the control principle would be incredibly hard, but, you know, it's also going to be incredibly hard to discard it, right? One way to respond to moral luck will be, and one way that some people want to, is just to say, well, we shouldn't really accept the control principle, you know, let's be consistent and just get rid of it. We'll also see that that's going to be really hard. This is one of those classical, really good philosophical problems where there's just a deep tension, perhaps even contradiction in our thoughts about the matter, and it's hard to resolve. Philosophy can point that out. Hard to know where to go from the tension, though. Okay, so next lecture, now that we have the control principle in the background, let's see what moral luck is and how it challenges this principle.